The church smelled of wet wood and lilies. Rain tapped against the stained glass windows as I stood beside Ethan's casket, my palms pressed together, my body stiff with exhaustion rather than grief. Grief requires clarity, and mine had been clouded by too many questions. Around me, people whispered the kind of whispers that slide between pity and curiosity. "Where's Margaret?" one woman asked. My stepmother was known for never missing an opportunity to be seen, especially at other people's tragedies. But today, her absence was deliberate. It was loud. When the priest began the final prayer, I scanned the pews one last time, half expecting her to appear in a black coat and pearls feigning sorrow. She didn't. I lowered my gaze to Ethan's coffin and whispered something only I could hear. Even now, she controls the silence. After the ceremony, I stood outside under the gray Illinois sky. The cold was biting, but the quiet was worse. People offered condolences like routine gestures, touching my arm, repeating words they didn't mean. "He's in a better place." They didn't know that Ethan hadn't been in a good place for years, not since Margaret began managing our lives under the guise of family guidance. I walked to my car, turned the key, and waited for the heat to rise. My phone buzzed. A single text appeared on the screen. "Sorry for your loss. M." The simplicity made my stomach turn. Margaret's condolences were never genuine. They were announcements of power. I opened Instagram out of some morbid impulse, and there it was, her profile glowing with new activity. The latest post stopped my breath. Margaret stood in a red bikini, cocktail in hand, laughing beside a man I didn't recognize. The location tag read, "Cancun, Mexico." The caption, "Cheers to new beginnings." For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating grief playing tricks on my perception, but the comments confirmed it. "You deserve this, Margaret. Finally living your best life." I stared at the image until my vision blurred. My husband was in a coffin an hour ago, and my stepmother, the woman who raised me, the woman who managed his finances, who told me to be patient with his temper, was drinking on a beach. I closed the app. The rain intensified. Somewhere deep inside me, something cold and sharp began to take form. The church emptied slowly, the sound of heels and murmured condolences fading into the rain. I remained seated long after the last person left, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the closed casket. The air was heavy with incense and grief, though mine felt strange, distant, like I was watching someone else's tragedy through glass. I should have cried, but I had learned long ago that tears only gave people permission to dismiss you as fragile. Margaret used to say that. "Crying is manipulation, Claire. Control yourself and you control others." The irony was that she had spent her life controlling everyone around her by pretending to be the calmest person in the room. I left the church and stood under the awning as the hearse pulled away. The driver nodded politely, as though this was any other job, any other body. I watched it until the red taillights vanished into the rain. The world had an unnerving way of carrying on while your life quietly collapsed. When I reached home, the house felt wrong. Too clean, too silent. The faint scent of Ethan's cologne still lingered in the bedroom, mixed with something metallic, the memory of a broken glass from the night before. His heart gave out. He had shouted, thrown a whiskey tumbler against the wall because I wouldn't let him take more pills. Margaret had called afterward, calm as ever. "Don't provoke him, Claire. He's under stress. You must understand the pressure he's under." I remember holding the phone, blood running down my arm from the glass shards, and realizing she would always defend him, even when the evidence was bleeding in front of her. Now he was gone, and she was drinking in Cancun. I went to the kitchen, turned on the small lamp, and sat at the table where Ethan and I had once planned a future that never happened. Bills were stacked neatly, envelopes unopened. On top sat a legal folder stamped with Margaret's signature. I opened it. The deed to the house had been transferred to a trust, her trust 3 days before Ethan's death. My name was nowhere. I felt the air leave my lungs. Every lesson she had taught about control she had executed flawlessly. I whispered her name into the empty kitchen, and it sounded less like grief and more like a declaration of war. The days after the funeral blurred together into something heavy and colorless. I woke, worked through the motions of living, then sat in silence until sleep forced me under. Grief wasn't loud. It was methodical. It crept into your bones and reorganized your thoughts. The house stripped of Ethan's voice echoed with things I wished I hadn't tolerated: his slammed doors, the half-hearted apologies, the way Margaret's phone calls always came moments after we fought. I began to notice details I'd ignored before. His office desk drawers were empty. The framed photo of us on our wedding day was missing. The safe in our closet hung open. Inside were a few papers, a watch, and a note from our lawyer reminding Ethan to finalize his will. But the signature line had been filled with Margaret's neat handwriting. I froze. The will that left everything to me had been replaced by a newer version transferring all assets into the Winslow Family Trust, Margaret's trust. It was dated 2 weeks before Ethan's death. Panic didn't hit immediately. Instead, there was a strange calm, the same kind I used to feel before presenting art critiques in college. You can't fix what you don't understand, I told myself. Start documenting. I began writing everything down: the dates, the calls, every conversation I could remember with Margaret. It read like a police report, not a diary. I titled it Margaret Case File. Each page pulled me deeper into the truth I'd refused to see. Margaret had been orchestrating everything not out of grief, but out of strategy. She had always treated our marriage as a merger, not a relationship. When Ethan and I fought, she comforted him like a mother and advised him like a partner. When I confided in her, she analyzed me like a weakness to be managed. Now she had taken everything and left me with the shell. That night, I called her. No answer. I tried again, straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice: "Even I found the papers, Margaret. Call me back." She never did. At midnight, I checked her social media again. Another photo appeared, this time a group shot. She sat at a beachside bar, laughing, surrounded by people much younger than her. The caption read, "Freedom feels expensive, but worth it." I stared until my vision blurred. Something inside me shifted. The woman who had stolen my father's loyalty, my husband's sanity, and now my home was not untouchable. She'd built her power on control, and people like her always forgot one thing: control only works if the other person stays quiet. I woke before dawn, unable to breathe under the weight of what I knew. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the rain against the windows. I made coffee I didn't drink and opened my laptop. The light from the screen painted the kitchen in pale blue. Margaret's Instagram was still public. The first thing I noticed wasn't the photo of her in the red bikini, though that was there mocking me with its careless joy, but the caption: "Cheers to new beginnings." The same words Ethan had said at dinner 3 nights before he died. It hadn't registered then, but now it did, like a splinter working its way out of skin. The comments beneath her post blurred as I scrolled. "You look amazing, Margaret. Finally living your best life." Someone wrote, "After all that drama, you deserve peace." I froze. That phrase, "after all that drama," was exactly what she had said about Ethan the week before his heart stopped. I could almost hear her voice again, smooth, rational, a tone that made everything sound like my fault. "He's drinking because he feels trapped, Claire. Maybe you should be more understanding." Understanding. That was her favorite word, her shield and her weapon. I clicked through her older posts. The transformation was startling. 3 weeks ago, her photos were muted: charity galas, garden parties, family dinners. Then came Ethan's death, and everything shifted. The filter changed from grayscale to sunlight, the captions from empathy to liberation. She wasn't mourning. She was celebrating. I opened Ethan's financial files next. Passwords, tax forms, loan agreements, all things he'd kept locked on his personal drive. One folder stood out: trust. Inside were scanned documents showing large transfers from our joint account to Margaret's trust fund. Dates lined up perfectly with the weeks leading up to his death. One transaction caught my eye: $80,000 wired 2 days before Ethan's supposed heart attack, labeled personal debt repayment. Ethan didn't owe her anything. That was the first crack. I opened a spreadsheet I'd made years earlier to track our mortgage. Numbers never lied, but people did. The mortgage payments had stopped the same month the trust fund started growing. Margaret had been draining us while pretending to help manage our finances. I leaned back in the chair, my reflection ghostly on the screen. My pulse was steady, not panic clarity. Margaret had always been one step ahead, but this time she had left fingerprints everywhere. I began saving screenshots, printing bank statements, organizing them into labeled folders. Each document felt like a weapon being sharpened. Around 7, the rain stopped. Sunlight cut through the clouds bright and cold. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and stared at my own face. Hollow eyes, drawn mouth, but something new behind them. Not fear. Calculation. I whispered her name, testing how it felt to say it without trembling. Margaret. The woman in the mirror didn't flinch. For the first time, I saw the resemblance between us two survivors of her manipulation, only one of us still pretending to be powerless. I turned back to the laptop. Her most recent story had just uploaded a boomerang of champagne glasses clinking her smile flawless. Freedom, the text read. My lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Enjoy it, I whispered to the empty house while you can. By noon the next day, I was sitting in the law office Ethan and I had once visited together pretending to plan our future. The same receptionist greeted me, her expression soft with pity. Mrs. Anderson, I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Hale will see you shortly. I nodded, my voice steady. Thank you. When I entered his office, Thomas Hale, a tall man with thinning hair and the patience of a monk, looked up from his desk. Claire, he said gently, I was just about to reach out regarding Ethan's estate. I took a seat across from him. That's why I'm here. He hesitated before continuing. I understand this is difficult, but I'm afraid things are complicated. Complicated was lawyer code for someone's already taken what's yours. He turned a document toward me. Your husband amended his will shortly before his passing. Most assets were transferred to the Winslow family trust. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Margaret's trust, I said flatly. Yes, he admitted. Ethan said it was to protect the estate from potential creditors. He seemed convinced it was a sound decision. Whose idea was that, I asked. Thomas hesitated. Mrs. Winslow introduced the concept. She handled the paperwork herself. Of course she had. I leaned forward. Mr. Hale, would you please tell me if any of these changes appeared forced? He adjusted his glasses. Legally speaking, the documents are valid. But ethically, he stopped himself, lowering his voice. I warned Ethan this could create conflicts. He seemed pressured. The word hung between us. Pressured. The same word I'd been using in my journal for years. I left the office with copies of everything. The moment I stepped into the cold afternoon air, I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Detective Laura Keene. She had investigated a domestic case for one of my art students years ago. Tough, pragmatic, allergic to lies. Keene, she answered. Laura, it's Claire Anderson. I need to ask a few questions about private investigations hypothetically. Hypothetically, she echoed amusement in her tone. What's wrong? I think my stepmother manipulated my husband into signing away everything before he died. A pause. Do you suspect foul play? I suspect intent, I said. And I have documents. Another pause, longer this time. Meet me tomorrow. Bring copies. If she touched financial records before a death, it's worth a closer look. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house, running my fingers along the cold furniture, every object tainted by Margaret's reach. I ended up in Ethan's office again, staring at the single drawer I hadn't opened. Inside, beneath a layer of receipts, was a small black notebook. Ethan's handwriting, chaotic slanted, filled the pages. Most entries were lists of tasks, but one section stood out. M insists I sign over assets, keeps saying it's to protect Claire, says I owe her, feels wrong, but she won't stop calling. The next line made my hands shake. Said if I don't comply, she'll tell Claire about the pills. I read it twice. The pills. Anti-anxiety medication Margaret had given him for stress. They'd always made him worse, paranoid aggressive. My throat tightened. She hadn't just taken our money. She'd taken his mind one pill at a time. I closed the notebook carefully and placed it beside the file labeled Trust. My evidence was growing, but so was my understanding this wasn't theft. It was orchestration. Margaret didn't kill Ethan's body. She dismantled his sanity and let the rest happen naturally. And if she thought I'd stay silent like he did, she'd miscalculated. I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I was the ghost she'd created, and I'd come to collect what she owed. Detective Laura Keene met me at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where truckers stopped for pie and no one asked questions. She was exactly as I remembered, gray trench coat. Sharp eyes, hair pulled back too tight to ever be casual. She slid into the booth across from me, her gaze flicking to the folder I placed between us. "You said you had documents," she said. I nodded. "Financial transfers, a rewritten will, and a pattern." I pushed the papers toward her. She flipped through them methodically, the way only cops and predators do, one page, one silence at a time. "You're saying your stepmother manipulated your husband into transferring assets before his death," she summarized. "Yes, and you believe she benefited financially from his passing." "Directly." Keene glanced up, unimpressed but intrigued. "You realize this is a serious accusation." "I'm aware," I said quietly. "That's why I'm here." She leaned back, studying me. "You don't sound like someone looking for sympathy." "I'm not." She tapped the papers. "There's enough here to raise questions, but not enough for a case. You'll need proof of coercion or intent, anything medical, pills, prescriptions, records." "Yes," I said, pulling the black notebook from my bag. "Ethan kept this. He wrote that Margaret pressured him into signing over assets, and she was giving him medication she claimed was for anxiety." Keene skimmed the entry, her jaw tightening. "Do you have the pills? No. They were gone when I got home from the hospital, and the prescription under her name. She said they were samples." Keene nodded slowly. "That's not legal. If she supplied unprescribed medication that led to his death, that's involuntary manslaughter at best, murder by manipulation at worst." The words hit me like static murder by manipulation. I'd thought it, but hearing it said aloud made it real. Keene continued, "I can't open a formal investigation without evidence of direct involvement. But I can advise you." She leaned forward. "Document everything. Don't confront her yet. People like your stepmother thrive on chaos. You stay calm, gather proof, and when she realizes you're not reacting, she'll make a mistake." I nodded. "And when she does," Keene's eyes narrowed, "you hand me the rope and I'll help her hang herself with it." That night, I returned home and followed her advice. I organized the timeline, cross-referenced the bank transfers with Margaret's travel records, even checked her phone activity. She had called Ethan 37 times in the week before he died, 37. Most late at night, always lasting less than 2 minutes. The pattern screamed control enough to provoke, never enough to expose. Around midnight, I poured myself a drink and opened my laptop. Margaret had posted again. This time, she wasn't alone. A man mid-40s, tan expensive watch stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. The caption read, "Found peace where the storms end." I stared at his face until recognition struck like lightning. 2 months ago, he'd been at our house, James Kerrigan, Ethan's financial advisor. My pulse slowed, deliberate, cold. So that was it. Margaret hadn't just orchestrated Ethan's death. She'd done it with help. I picked up my phone, recorded my own voice for the first time in days. "Margaret Winslow, James Kerrigan, collusion, coercion, and fraud. I have evidence, and soon so will the law." Then I saved the file and whispered to the empty room, "You taught me control, Margaret. Now you'll see what it looks like when it's not yours." I made a list. It was how I thought best, the way I had organized canvases in art school, layers, margins, a clear sequence. First, corroboration. Detective Keene agreed to open a preliminary inquiry if I produced a chain of transactions and communications that implied coordination rather than coincidence. I spent the next days like a surgeon, precise and unhurried. I called banks, requested statements, and signed forms that felt invasive and necessary. Each page that came back revealed decisions made in the margins of ordinary life. James Kerrigan's name surfaced where it should not have been. Wire transfers labeled consulting fees traced through a Delaware entity, invoices aligned to hotel bookings in Cancun, a boutique jewelry charge with Margaret's initials. The trust documents bore signatures resembling Ethan's, but under scrutiny, the strokes betrayed hesitation and mechanical repetition. It read like someone tracing motion, not composing thought. Detective Keene recommended a forensic document examiner. His name was Alonzo Ruiz, a grave, exact man who treated handwriting like a psychological profile. He examined the pages in my kitchen with a magnifier and a steady hand. "This is not his hand," he said. "It's been traced from a sample. Look at the baseline. See how the pressure is inconsistent." He pointed out a microscopic tremor where a forger had hesitated before making a final flourish. Whoever did this had access to his signatures, he added without drama. We followed the money with a patience that felt strange after months of being gaslit into believing nothing mattered. Bank after bank, account after account, the pattern emerged. A large deposit flowed into a shell company, then to an offshore account in the Bahamas, and finally dispersed into smaller accounts. The trail smelled of intent. Keene began the process of subpoenas and holds. We were a small force inside an institutional machine, but machines can fail under persistent pressure. A neighbor named Rosa offered testimony that caught me off guard. She had seen Margaret and James arguing in a grocery store parking lot weeks before Ethan's death. She was talking like someone deciding things, not like someone grieving, Rosa said. Her memory was ordinary and human. It fit into the legal narrative like a needle into fabric. I recorded her statement, careful to preserve the cadence of her words. Then, a discovery in an old folder changed everything. Buried in Ethan's laptop was an email sent from an account using Margaret's maiden name. "It was clinical and businesslike. He will comply," it said. "We cannot have him make choices that jeopardize the settlement." Attached were scanned hotel reservations for Cancun that matched her posts. I printed the emails and placed them on my dining table, each sheet a deliberate footprint of betrayal. Margaret's public performance had rested on ritual flowers lunches, the right curtains at the right hour. In private, she had been meticulous and surgical. The documents made her invisible arrogance visible. The more we compiled, the tighter the perimeter around her influence became. She called twice that week, once in the morning with a voice like butter, and once at night when the house seemed empty. I recorded both calls. "Claire, darling," she said in the day, remedying a concern I had not voiced. "These matters are complicated," she told me that night. I answered neither. Allowing her to speak would be to give her the stage. Detective Keene finally told me she was ready to present the file to the prosecutor. "They need a narrative that proves intent," she said. "You have it. We will package it cleanly." I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paper and light, and for the first time since Ethan's funeral, I felt the quiet satisfaction of work done properly. The wait that followed was precise and strange. I understood then that justice moves slowly, not because it is weak, but because it must be undeniable. I arranged my days around the file teaching in the mornings, compiling evidence at night, and occasionally checking Margaret's public face as if cataloging a specimen. The case had a rhythm now, and I matched it. Margaret called again on a Thursday morning. The sun had just risen sharp and pale through the blinds, slicing across the papers on my table. I let the phone ring once, twice, then answered. "Claire, dear," she said brightly. "You've been so distant." "I'm worried." Her voice was smooth as silk stretched too thin. "You seem busy," I said. Mexico looked restful. A pause. "Grief takes many forms," she replied. "We all cope differently." I smiled without warmth. "Some with cocktails." Her tone sharpened just slightly. "You shouldn't believe everything online. People misinterpret." "Do they?" I asked. "Like signing someone else's name?" Silence. Then her laugh controlled practiced. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." I hung up before she could finish the sentence. Keene had advised me not to engage, but part of me wanted to hear her voice bend to listen for cracks in her perfect composure. That afternoon, the district attorney's office confirmed receipt of the report. Keene had packaged everything: financial trails, forged signatures, the pharmacy logs from Ethan's medical records showing prescriptions issued under Margaret's account. It was all there, woven tight enough to hold. "They're opening a preliminary case," Keene told me. "Don't celebrate yet. This will take months." "I can wait," I said. Waiting was something Margaret had taught me well. Weeks passed like slow fire. I went back to teaching lecturing about chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and dark. My students talked about art as if it were redemption, but I knew better. Art didn't save you. It exposed you. One afternoon, as I erased the whiteboard, my phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Financial Advisor, James Kerrigan, under investigation for fraud. I clicked it open. The article detailed an ongoing inquiry into Kerrigan's offshore accounts discrepancies traced back to multiple clients, including Ethan Anderson. The investigation had been triggered by an anonymous tip. I smiled. Margaret's empire was cracking. Not because I shouted, but because I whispered in the right ears. That night, she showed up at my house. No warning, no text. Her knock was polite, her expression immaculate. She wore a beige coat and pearls like she'd come from brunch, not betrayal. "May I come in?" she asked. "No," I said. "You already have." Her smile wavered. "You think you're clever. But this?" She gestured vaguely toward the house. "This isn't yours anymore." "Neither is the money," I said quietly, "or the story you've been telling." Her eyes flickered the calm, slipping for a heartbeat. "Be careful, Claire. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I do," I said. "A woman who mistakes manipulation for strength." I closed the door slowly, deliberately. Through the glass, I saw her reflection linger unmoving before she turned and walked to her car. The engine revved, then faded down the street. I stood there, pulse steady, knowing what that look meant. Margaret wasn't running anymore. She was preparing to fight. 2 days later, Keene called. She's hired a lawyer, and she's trying to move assets again. Can she? Not easily. We froze what we could, but she's desperate. That's good for us. Desperation makes predators clumsy. Margaret would dig her own grave the same way she'd built her fortune meticulously, one false document at a time. I poured myself tea and looked at the rain streaking the window the way it had the day of Ethan's funeral. Only this time the silence didn't feel like control. It felt like victory waiting for proof. The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning. A crisp envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a notice confirming that Margaret Winslow was officially under federal investigation for financial fraud, falsification of documents, and prescription tampering. I read it 3 times, my hands perfectly still. The silence in the house felt different, no longer oppressive, but watchful like the air before a storm breaks. I took a photo of the document and sent it to Detective Keene. Her reply came within minutes. "They've frozen her primary accounts. It's moving faster than expected. Stay alert." I brewed coffee steady and deliberate and looked out the window toward the small garden Ethan and I had once planted together. He'd hated the maintenance. Margaret had called it a poor investment. I tended it anyway. Now the hydrangeas were in full bloom, defiant in their color. By afternoon, my phone buzzed again, unknown number. I answered, half expecting Keene. "Claire," a man's voice said. "James Kerrigan. We need to talk." I didn't respond. "Look," he continued, "this is getting out of control." I didn't know what she was planning. I was just handling transfers. She said it was a family matter. "You forged my husband's signature," I said evenly. "That's not a family matter. You don't understand. She had leverage." "So did I said and hung up. 30 minutes later, I received an email from him. The subject line read "for protection." Attached were scanned documents, memos between him and Margaret. Her handwriting was unmistakable, sharp slanted each word, dripping command. "Ensure the trust is finalized. He's weak, easily persuaded. Use the medication if necessary." I forwarded the file to Keene without hesitation. Her response was curt. "This is the nail, Claire. Good work." That night my doorbell rang again. This time I didn't flinch. Margaret stood outside. No pearls, no smile. Her hair was disheveled, her lipstick smeared. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You think this will bring him back?" "No," I said softly. "But it will stop you from doing it again." She stepped closer, her perfume cloying and heavy, a mask of normalcy cracking around her eyes. "You ungrateful little fool. Everything you have is because of me. I made you strong." "You made me silent," I replied. "That's not strength." Her hand trembled as she raised it, half a threat, half a reflex, but I didn't move. "You should be careful, Claire," she whispered, her voice suddenly calm again, the predator reassembling. "You don't know how dangerous truth can be." I met her gaze, unblinking. "Neither do you." Keene arrived 20 minutes after Margaret left. She'd been tracking her car. "We intercepted communication between her and Kerrigan," she said. She's trying to move evidence offshore. That ends tonight. By morning, the news broke across every major outlet. Prominent philanthropist under investigation for fraud and criminal conspiracy. The photo accompanying the headline showed Margaret being led from her house in handcuffs, her face carefully turned away from the cameras. The pearls were gone, replaced by the hollow glare of someone who had run out of scripts. I watched it unfold on television in silence. Keene called an hour later. "It's over," she said. "She's being held without bail. The DA wants your statement tomorrow." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. After the call, I sat on the edge of the bed, the sunlight spilling across the floor like gold dust. I thought of Ethan, his laughter before the pills, his apologies after the way he'd looked at me like I was something fragile that couldn't survive the truth. I whispered into the quiet, I survived anyway. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt reclaimed. But I knew this wasn't the end. Justice, like grief, was a process, and I was still learning how to live inside both. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras pointed toward the marble doors as if truth might appear from within them. I walked through the crowd, my coat buttoned, my expression unreadable. The winter air cut through everything: grief, fear, even memory. Inside, the courtroom hummed with low voices. Margaret sat at the defense table immaculate again. Her hair was smooth, her pearls restored her posture a performance of dignity, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted toward me sharp and restless, as though she couldn't decide whether to pity or hate me. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically: financial records, falsified signatures, prescription, tampering witness statements. Kerrigan's testimony sealed it. He confessed to falsifying Ethan's documents under her direction, describing her as calculating, persuasive, and precise. Every word he spoke stripped another layer from Margaret's composure. When they showed the handwritten memo, "Use the medication if necessary," her face stiffened just for a second. I saw it, the recognition that her empire was cracking in public and she couldn't control the narrative. The defense tried to twist it. A grieving widow and a stepmother simply helping her family manage assets, her lawyer said, voice smooth as glass. But the evidence was a tide. It couldn't be reasoned with. When I took the stand, the room went still. The attorney asked me to describe my relationship with her. I answered calmly. "Margaret Winslow married my father when I was 12. She believed control was love. She taught me that silence was survival. And with your husband, she managed our finances. She told Ethan I was fragile, told me he was unstable. She made sure we both depended on her, until he died and she no longer needed either of us. Do you believe she caused his death?" I paused. The court waited. "I believe she engineered it," I said. "She didn't need to kill him directly. She just needed to create the right pressure and let nature finish her work." Margaret's gaze burned through me. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might smile, but it never came. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I waited in the hallway, Keene beside me, her arms crossed. When the doors opened, I could read it in the jurors' faces before the foreman spoke. "Guilty. All counts. Fraud, forgery, criminal conspiracy, manslaughter." The sound that followed wasn't applause or relief, it was silence. Margaret didn't turn to look at me when they took her away. Her chin was high, her mask intact, until the last second when the flash of a camera caught her eyes. There was no remorse, only disbelief, like she'd fallen from a story she thought she wrote. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. Keene clasped my shoulder. "It's done," she said. "For her, maybe," I replied. "Not for me." That night, I returned home and sat in Ethan's office one last time. The room felt lighter now, the darkness receding like a tide. I opened his notebook again and found the last page blank, except for one sentence written in his hurried scrawl: "I hope she never wins." He hadn't specified who she was. Maybe he meant Margaret. Maybe he meant the part of himself she'd built. Either way, I whispered the words back into the quiet. She didn't. Then I closed the notebook for good. The news cycle devoured Margaret's fall with an appetite for irony. Philanthropist and family matriarch sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The networks ran clips of her charity galas and televised interviews, splicing them against footage of her being escorted through courthouse corridors in an orange jumpsuit. Viewers marveled at the transformation, as though her guilt were a costume change instead of a revelation. I watched the coverage without satisfaction. Justice, I learned, doesn't come with applause. It comes with paperwork and silence. Detective Keene called the morning after sentencing. "It's over," she said, her tone a mixture of weariness and quiet pride. "She'll serve her time." Kerrigan took a plea. "The trust's assets are being liquidated. You'll get what's left." "I don't want her money," I replied. "Then donate it," she said simply. "Turn poison into something useful." That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since the trial. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and chrysanthemums. Ethan's grave was modest, simple stone, simple name. I knelt, tracing the engraving with my fingertips. "It's done," I said softly. "She can't touch us anymore." A breeze stirred the trees, scattering yellow leaves across the path. I imagined him there, not as the man he became under her thumb, but as the one he was before. Warm, earnest, flawed human. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry. The tears weren't dramatic or cleansing. They were quiet, deliberate, the kind that build from years of restraint. Grief, when stripped of manipulation, becomes truth. I left a single hydrangea from our garden beside the headstone and walked back to the car. The drive home was long and strangely peaceful. That evening, I began sorting through the remaining documents. Letters, old photos, financial statements, artifacts of a life half claimed by someone else. In one envelope, I found a receipt for medication dated a week before Ethan's death. The prescription bore Margaret's signature but listed Ethan's name. She had forged even that. I scanned the paper and sent it to Keene. Her reply was brief. "We'll add it to the record. It strengthens the case against her for medical fraud." It was no longer my burden to carry. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and watched the city shift from dusk to darkness. Margaret would spend the rest of her life in confinement, a woman trapped by the walls she'd built for others. I, on the other hand, was free for the first time in years. But freedom felt strange, like stepping into a house where every sound is unfamiliar. Over the following weeks, I began teaching again. My lectures on art and psychology took on a different tone. I spoke about composition not as balance, but as reclamation, how every shadow needs intention to exist. Students lingered after class, asking quiet questions about resilience, about starting over. I never mentioned my story, but they seemed to sense it the way survivors recognize one another. One evening after class, I stopped by the art studio and pulled a blank canvas from storage. I painted until my hands ached, strokes of gray-blue and faint crimson converging into something abstract yet inevitable. When it dried, I titled it Inheritance. Not of money or pain, but of truth. The next morning, I donated every cent from the dissolved trust to a foundation supporting victims of domestic and psychological abuse. The confirmation email arrived with a single line: "Your contribution has been received." I stared at the words for a long time, then closed my laptop. The file named Margaret Case still sat on my desktop. I didn't delete it. Some ghosts are worth keeping, if only to remind you what silence can cost. Spring arrived without ceremony. The air softened, the rain turned to mist, and the house that once felt haunted now simply felt lived in. I kept the windows open most mornings, letting in the sounds I used to drown out birds, traffic windproof that life continued without permission. The trial had ended months ago, yet the headlines still surfaced occasionally. Winslow appeals sentence, denied Kerrigan, disbarred family trust, dissolved. Each headline felt less like victory and more like punctuation. The story was over, the echo remained. I spent my mornings teaching, my afternoons painting, and my evenings writing a different kind of record, not of crimes or evidence, but of memory. I wanted to understand how control disguises itself as care, how love turns into leverage, how a person learns to reclaim their name after it's been spoken like a command. Therapy helped. So did silence. I learned that silence wasn't the enemy, it was how you used it. Margaret had used it to dominate, to suffocate. I learned to use it to heal. Detective Keene visited once in early April. She looked tired but lighter, as though the case had settled something inside her, too. We sat on the porch drinking tea. "You know, she said most people don't see it through like you did. They get scared. They give up." "I didn't do it for revenge," I said. "I did it so it would stop." "And it did," she replied. "That's what justice looks like. Not loud, just final." Before she left, she handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a court copy of the sentencing summary. At the bottom, the judge's note read, "The defendant exhibited deliberate and prolonged manipulation resulting in psychological and financial harm. The evidence presented by the victim demonstrates exceptional clarity and restraint." I folded the document carefully and filed it away with the rest. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like proof that restraint could be power. A week later, I held a small exhibition at a community gallery. I didn't invite anyone from the old circles, no reporters, no donors, no ghosts from the Winslow family orbit. The collection was titled The Quiet Line. Each painting explored a boundary, the thin divide between love and control, grief and freedom, silence and voice. One piece drew the most attention, a dark horizon bisected by a single streak of light. A woman stopped beside me and whispered, "It feels like survival." I smiled. "It is." The gallery lights dimmed as the evening ended, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel watched. I drove home with the windows down, the night air cold and clean. At home, I walked to the backyard where Ethan's old garden had begun to bloom again. The hydrangeas were thriving, stubborn and bright, their petals pale blue against the soil. I knelt and brushed the dirt from a stone marker I'd placed there after the sentencing. It wasn't a grave. Just a small plaque engraved with a line I'd written myself, "Justice doesn't shout. It endures." I sat there for a while, listening to the wind move through the branches, thinking about everything Margaret had taken and everything she'd accidentally given me, the understanding that power without empathy collapses, that control without love isolates, that silence in the right hands can rebuild. As the sun set behind the fence, I whispered a quiet promise to the air. "I forgive, but I don't forget." The words weren't for her. They were for me. I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and turned toward the house. The lights glowed warm through the windows. For the first time, it looked like a home again. Not a place where things had been taken, but where something new could begin. I closed the door behind me and truly felt that the story was mine now and it was finished.